As you know, no website is ever really completed. You're always needing to modify data, move elements around, and change the look and feel of your website. You need to be able to do this, that is, modify the layout and design, without modifying the markup of each page. That would be the goal. That is, change everything about the page, but not touch the markup. We need some way to separate the design of the page from the content of the page. And there are several ways to modify the layout. We'll start by using HTML to format content. If you think back, way back when, originally, HTML tags were created to define layout only and nothing more. Things like H1, P, and table were the original HTML tags. Over time, web browsers became more sophisticated, and they added support for more layout tags like font and bold and that sort of thing, and people started creating pages that used HTML tags to format their content. Given the sample page we're about to look at, imagine that you'd like all fonts to be in the Verdana face. We want the first two links to be bold, we want all links to be in a small font style, and we want the header and intro text to be blue. Well, let's see how we can accomplish that by working directly with the HTML content of the page. If we look at the page we're trying to modify, here's where we start, and it's all just standard HTML stuff in here, no ASP information at all. It's just HTML for this example. We'd like to modify this so that all the fonts, everything on the page, uses Verdana. The first two links here need to be bold. I'm not sure why, but that's the rule. All the links should be in a small font style, and the header and the intro, that's this stuff, at the top, should be blue. Well, how can we accomplish that by modifying the HTML? Well, let's go to Source View. Actually, I'm going to go to Split View so we can see both the design and the HTML view at one time. Now, I do want to preserve the current state of the page. So I'm going to take a snapshot of the contents of that body tag, copy to the clipboard, paste it down here, and just comment it out. So we have a backup copy. Did you know you can use the keystrokes Control-K, Control-C to comment out a block of code any place in Visual Studio? Now, when you're working in split view like this, you'll often find that design view is out of sync with source view. If you just click here, they refresh the page. Just mention that'll come up, and there's no way around it. To modify the HTML markup here, we'll start by adding a font tag. So right up here at the top, we'll insert our font element, and it nicely puts in the closing one for us. I'll take the closing one and put it down here at the bottom. Okay, so we've set up the font, and that's fine. We didn't tell it what font to use, of course. So inside the font tag, let's add face equals and specify the face we'd like to use for our page. And of course, it's out of sync, but as soon as we sync it up, we do see we have a new font. Well, great, that works fine. We've set up the font. Now let's modify the two links we want to make bold. So I'll just put a B tag around the text. I'm not recommending this as a solution. I'm just pointing out this is one way to affect the formatting of a page. As a matter of fact, I'm guessing this is probably the worst way to do it. But it's nice to see how you would do it using HTML. And finally, we want each link to have a font size of 2. So I'll go in and add that as well. The font element, and then size equals 2, and then put the closing font tag after each one. There we go. And I'll just copy and paste this to the clipboard. Oops, paste it back, come down here, put it in, put the closing font tag here. And once more, on the third link, we'll do the same thing. Well, good grief, this is a lot of effort. If we refresh the page, there we go. And if we view it in the browser, We have all the links set up. Well, they're bold. The font's correct. We didn't quite get the blue in there. So let's add one more tag in here around the H1 and the text. So I'll add one more, font color equals blue, and end that after that text. And finally, everything's blue that should be blue. View it in the browser. And we're done. Don't ever do this. We've certainly made the page very difficult to maintain because all the formatting is embedded directly within the HTML stream. Well, these links are still active, luckily. We have our tame animals, our wild animals, and our farm animals. I'm not quite sure what these things are, but in any case, we have our farm animals and we're all set. We've done our formatting. But there has to be a better way to make that work than using HTML tags embedded within the stream. Defining your layout in pure HTML is severely limiting. There's only so much you can do with HTML, and of course it does place the formatting directly in the content stream. You can use the style element, and now you have real power. The style element always looks something like this. You'll have a series of property name : values, followed by a semicolon, then another property name : value, followed by a semicolon, and so on. And you can have as many styles as you need within that style element. Now, the syntax of inline styles are the same as for creating external styles. And it's all more expressive than HTML, but it's still limiting. That is, using inline styles is more expressive, but it's still more limiting than creating external styles. You'll find that it's better to factor styles into style sheets, which we'll do in just a moment. But for now, let's go back to our page and add some inline styles so we can get rid of the HTML style information. I'll go to Source View so I have a little more room to work here, and I'm going to remove all the formatting I've added to my links. Is removing this stuff, and on the back end, we'll remove that stuff. And the same thing down here. I'll remove the formatting from the second link and from the third link. And let's start from scratch. Let's use instead the style attribute to define the behavior here. So I'll go to my links, and for each one of them I'll add a style attribute equals, and now you even get IntelliSense within Visual Studio to help you with the styles. So I'll choose font weight, and we'll discuss more about these styles in just a bit. And I'll choose one of the options, bold. And I'll use font size, and one of the attributes is small. That sounds good. So let's copy that now to each of the other ones, except of course on the third one I don't want the bold, so I'll remove the font weight attribute there. Okay, let's give it a try. If we go to split view, you'll see that we get the same exact behavior, but we're not having embedded HTML. We're using the style attribute instead. And so there's nothing dealing with the content that describes the formatting of that content. It's all factored out here in this style attribute. It's better, but it's still not a terribly good solution because we're still mixing layout with content information in the same stream of data. You can improve your style usage by extracting the style information away from specific elements. Instead, you want to group them in a style sheet. Now you can place that style sheet internally within the page, and the styles apply only to elements on that page, or you can place them externally in a separate file, and in that case, the file will generally have an extension CSS for Cascading Style Sheet, and you can apply the styles to multiple pages in a site. Seems like a good idea. And of course, you can mix everything we've talked about. You can have an external file. You can have an internal style sheet that overrides the external file. You can have inline styles that override everything else. And of course, you can mix in some HTML styling if you want, but I'd really avoid that if you can. When you define a style, you'll always use this same syntax. What goes inside the curly braces matches what you saw with the inline style. That is, there's style colon value semicolon, style colon value, and so on, as many as you want. Within the style sheet, you also need a selector, and the selector can be one of several different things. It can be a tag, such as H1, P, or table, and then this style applies to every element of that type. Every H1, every P, every table. You can also supply multiple elements to apply the style to all of them. That is, the selector could be H1 space, P space, table, and it would then apply to all those elements. You can use a specific ID, that is an element ID, using the hashmark ID format. Or you can have a named class, using .className as the selector. We'll see how we can apply all of these as we work through examples throughout this section. These embedded style sheets, if you decide to put it within the page, must appear within the head element and must be surrounded with a style element. And you'll see the style element also must have a type attribute whose value is text/CSS. That's required in modern browsers to indicate that it is a CSS type style sheet. Well, let's try defining a style sheet. We'll start simple and then get fancier as we move along. Well, I'm going to toss out everything we've done inside this body tag and go back to my original. I can uncomment this selection by pressing Control-K, Control-U. What I'd like to do is create some styles within this page, an embedded style sheet. So here, within the head element, I'm going to create a style element. There we go. And of course, for this to work, I also must have the type attribute. And you see that's the option they supply. And that's what I need. Okay, so within this, I'm going to create a couple of styles. I'll create a body style, which should apply to everything within the body element. I'll make it say font family, colon, Verdana, semicolon, color, colon, blue. IntelliSense really helps out here, no? That's pretty nice. Let's finish that up. No quote, of course, at the end. Let's add another style for anchor tags, and we'll make the font size be small. And there we are. So far, we've created styles that apply to elements by type. And at this point, with no further changes, if I go to Design View, you'll see we have affected the things we asked for. We got Verdana font, we got the color of everything to be blue, and for anchor tags, A elements, we have the font size set to small. Now, by the way, here in Source View, if you want a style that applies to every single thing on the page, use asterisk. So if I wanted everything, no matter what on this page, to have a certain style, I could design it this way and put the style information in here. Let's try creating a class-based style. You can apply this to any number of elements by specifying the CSS class for that particular element. So let's try it. I'll put in here .bold link, because that's the way you specify a class-based style with a period in front. And I'll make this be font weight. Make it bold. If you only have one style, you don't need to put the semicolon. I like to put it, though, because that makes it easier for future additions to go on. I wouldn't have to add a semicolon. So to be consistent, I guess I should put those here, too. But it's not ever necessary to put that final semicolon on there. Okay, well, we wanted, say, this link to be bold. So all I have to do is add, in HTML, the class attribute and indicate, isn't this smart? They see that the only CSS class that's available is bold link. So I can just select that from my IntelliSense and press Tab. Let's go back to Design View. I'll just go to Split View here. And we can verify that the first tag is now bold because it belongs to the bold link class. and bold link class indicates that we should use a font weight of bold. Let's try the same thing with an ID-based style. So I'm going to go down first of all and change the ID of the final link, well, this one anyway, the wild animal one. I'll add an ID of wild link. And now let's go create an ID-based style. You do that with a hash mark. And this one is going to be also bold. Font weight. Oh, let's make it, bold's good enough. There we go. And now because we've assigned the ID wild link to this control, it'll appear using the wild link style. The big difference between these two is that multiple controls can belong to the same class. We could assign, for example, this link to also belong to that class. But only one element on the page can have this ID. So you'll only use this once on a page, because on a single page, every ID must be unique. This, however, could be applied to multiple controls on the same page. If we go back to Design View, we'll see that this one is now bold as well because its ID is wild link and we have an ID-based style named wild link. Well, the beauty of this is you can change the formatting without touching the content of the page. For example, what if I now decided that all my links need to be really small? So I can come along and change the style for my links and choose extra, extra small. There we go. And now when we view the page again, you'll see my links are really teeny. And I've changed them without touching the content of the page. That's the beauty of working with styles. Now note that because we've put the style sheet embedded within this page, these styles apply only to this page. If we wanted the styles to apply to another page as well, we would need to create an external style sheet and somehow link it to this page. And of course, that's coming up next. If you can create an embedded style sheet, you can easily create a linked style sheet. Remember, a linked style sheet can apply to multiple pages within your site. All you have to do is create a file named something.css, either default or style sheet or whatever you want, and copy the contents of your style element from your embedded style sheet to that new document. Then, add a link to the style sheet to any HTML or ASPX page, and that page will respect the styles in the style sheet. I've used this technology in demos before now, sort of assuming you just buy into it. But in this section, we'll see how to actually create your own style sheet and add it as a link to a page. I'll start by creating a new item in my project, and to do that, I'll add a new item. The language here is immaterial. Choose whichever you like because we're not going to have any code. What I need is a style sheet, and it's here. And I'll name mine stylesheet.css. That's fine. Actually, you know what? I want to name this one sample.css, just so it matches what I expect to find later on. So here is my sample.css, and it's ready to go. What I need to do is copy the style sheet out of this page and paste it into that external style sheet. All I need are the styles here. So I will cut those to the clipboard. I've removed them from here, and I will instead paste them in here. There we go. Indentation doesn't really matter, though I could come here and get rid of the indents. So we now have 4 styles within our style sheet. So I'll save everything. And now I need some way to link the style sheet sample.css to our page default.htm. The easiest way to do this is go to Design View and drag the style sheet onto the designer. You can see clearly it worked, but what happened when I dragged it on? You can see here within the head element that we've added a link to our style sheet. You can see it's a style sheet and its type is text/CSS. So we've got everything working the way it was before, except now we have our style sheet stored externally, and it could be applied to more than a single page. You can, of course, type that link manually. You don't have to drag and drop, but it's easier if you do. And by the way, if you just drag it into the head element yourself, even in source view, it brings in the right thing. So you don't have to do it in design view. You can do it in source view. But if you do it in source view, you have to be careful about where you put it. If you do it in design view, they always put it in the right place for you. You can link to an external style sheet in a number of different ways. For example, it's going to look something like this. You'll have a link. The rel equals style sheet says it's a style sheet. We get an href which has the location, and the type equals text/CSS. Now, if the style sheet's in the same folder as the page you're working with, all you have to do is say href equals and the name of the file. If it's in a specific subfolder, you can say folder name /style sheet name. If it's on some other server somewhere, you can have the href refer to an entire URL, which describes where you can find that style sheet. What that indicates is you can basically steal style sheets from other websites. As long as you have the address, you can use somebody else's style sheet. I'm not recommending you steal, but it's just possible that you can. We probably should step back and say, what is CSS really? Well, Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS, was developed in 1994, remember that year, as a means of separating formatting from content in HTML, clearly a major goal. It provided new tools for laying out content and allowed for formatting centralization within your website. There are basically three levels that became standardized by the World Wide Web Consortium. There's CSS Level 1 and CSS Level 2 that contain all the elements we'll be using. And there's also CSS Level 3, which is currently still in draft form. We won't really talk about any of those features. They deal with media and images and the kinds of things we don't need to deal with for this introductory lesson. If you think about the name, Cascading Style Sheets, and think through the words, well, sheets is all about collecting formatting and layout information. And we have a sequential list of formatting instructions, and the order matters in the style sheet. From top to bottom, the last thing you come to is the one that has precedence. The word style. Well, CSS is all about formatting and layout, that is, style. It's not concerned with content, only with layout. And finally, there's that word cascading. Well, CSS allows for a hierarchy of formatting and layout. It's common to have multiple style sheets for a document. You group the formatting by usage within individual sheets, and style sheets and documents are generally many-to-many. You'll have multiple style sheets, multiple documents, and they refer to each, well, they don't refer to each other, but multiple documents refer to one or more of those style sheets, and the style sheets are used by one or more documents. Now, of course, styles can be redundant and even overlapping. How do you determine the precedence of redundant styles? Well, you might have styles defined in the sheet, in one or more multiple cascading style sheets external to your document. Well, first of all, the lowest priority is the browser default. If there's no style applied, well, you get the browser default, but that's the lowest priority. Next would be an external style sheet. That's the kind of stuff that would be stored in a CSS file within your project or somewhere else. Next, in higher priority, is an internal style sheet. An internal style sheet takes precedence over an external style sheet. It makes sense because you want to be able to use the internal styles to override external styles. Finally, the one with the highest precedence is an inline style. The style attribute within an element in HTML gives preference to the inline style. It always wins. Also, the order within a given sheet is significant. The last style that's found always wins. So if you have two declarations for the same style, the second one is the one that gets applied. In the following set of slides and demos, we're going to investigate specific CSS attributes. We'll look at font attributes, color attributes, margins and alignment attributes, positioning attributes, and we'll also look at partitioning elements using the div and span elements within HTML. These become very important when you want to apply styles to a portion of a larger element. Let's start by looking at fonts. There are lots of font and text attributes, and the most common are covered here, including the font family, the font style, the font variant, font weight, font size, and text decoration. Let's start by looking at font family. You use the font name as the value. For example, this style, applied to H1 elements, would use Comic Sans MS as the name of the font family. But what if the client computer doesn't have the font you're asking for? Not every computer has Comic Sans MS. I'm sure someone running OS X on a Macintosh doesn't have Comic Sans MS. They might, but most likely they don't. It's best to include at least one generic font family when you define the font families for your style. So you could list them with commas separating them. Here's how you would list 3 possible font families. The browser would attempt to use the first one. If it doesn't find it, it'll use the second. If it doesn't find that, it moves to the third, and so on. You can even mix font names with generic font families. For example, serif is a font family, as is sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy fonts. And each one of them has a single default behavior within Internet Explorer and other browsers as well. So that if your machine doesn't have Garamond or Times New Roman, it will use the default serif font in this example. So if you want to be really careful, you always put as the last font a generic font family. I've loaded the sample page fontfamily.htm, which includes an embedded style sheet with a number of different styles. I'm using an embedded style sheet for this and subsequent demonstrations because it makes it easy to have separate styles for separate pages. You'll see that I have an H1, H2, and H3 element-based style, and these apply to header 1, header 2, and header 3 elements. Down here we have a header 1, header 2, and header 3 element. For header 1, we'll use Comic Sans MS. Well, let's look at this actually. For header 1, we use Comic Sans MS. For header 2, we use Tahoma if it's available. If not, Arial, then Courier. For header 3, we use Garamond, and if that's not available, Times New Roman. And then a family, a generic font family named serif. So we'll use a serifed font if it can't find any of the named font families. Now for the rest of it, I'm using ID-based styles. I have ID-based styles P1 through P7, and down here I have paragraphs whose IDs are P1 through P6. I don't have a P7. So what do the styles look like? Well, let's scroll down. You can see that for paragraph 1, I said use Times New Roman, then Arial. Let's not do that. If I click on something, they select it. There we go. That is going to be Arial. For paragraph 3, we have, it's difficult to keep these in sync, huh? Courier New. Paragraph 4 is Lucida handwriting. Paragraph 5 is Jokerman. And paragraph 6 is Garamond. So we're using a number of different font styles here on the same page based on these IDs. Now if I apply the P7 ID, clearly my font does not exist. So in that case, we'll use the generic font family sans serif. Let's try it. If I come down here and change this, say this one, to P7, and then refresh down here, this one is now using a generic sans serif font. Because we don't have a font named my font, we go with the next best thing, which is this sans serif basic default font. So you can see there are lots of ways to combine font families and specific font names using different style types, element-based, ID-based, and of course, class-based as well. The font style provides 4 different options. There's normal, italic, oblique, and inherit. you'll most likely use one of normal and italic. Oblique programmatically creates tilted text. That's useful if you want to use a font for which there isn't an italic version. They'll just tilt the thing over by moving pixels around. It never looks as good as a real italic font. Inherit provides the default behavior for the container of the current control. That is, it inherits from the parent element, and that's the default behavior. The syntax looks something like this. You'll just say selector, and then in curly braces, font style, colon, one of these four values, normal, italic, oblique, or inherit. The font variant style allows for normal or small caps, and that's it. So you'll look at syntax something like this, where you specify the font variant style and then either small caps or normal. The font weight defines the boldness of text. You'll most likely use normal or bold. You also can use the numbers 100, 200, 300, and so on through 900. 400 equals normal, and 700 equals bold. Most fonts really can't show 9 different boldnesses. I've never seen one that even comes close to supplying more than 3 or 4 different boldnesses, so you'll rarely use the in-between ones. You can also use relative options, comparative to the default parent element. Remember that in most cases you inherit the behavior of your parent element, but you can specify bolder and lighter, and those will be with respect to what you would have been if you hadn't specified this attribute. Font size gives you 4 different ways, 4 different notations to specify the size. You can choose a relative keyword, like extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large, and those are defined by the browser. You can specify something that's relative to the parent, like smaller or larger. That actually means smaller or larger than you would have been if you hadn't specified a font size. Percentage of parent lets you say 50% of what I would have been, or 30% of what I would have been, or 120% of what I would have been. And finally, you can use an absolute measure, as in 18 point, half an inch, 3 centimeters, or 30 pixels. You can use those measurements to get specific sizes for your font. The final text-based style attribute is the text decoration. This has 4 possible values: none, that is no decoration, underline, italic, and line through. Line through gives you, obviously, a line through the text. You can use this attribute to add or remove attributes, and you combine them using a space between the values. So if you want something to be underlined and italic, the style value would be underline space italic. Here's a commonly used trick. You can use the text decoration to remove the underline from a hyperlink. That is, if you want your hyperlinks to appear without an underline, just set the text decoration attribute to be none, and you'll see no underline on your hyperlinks. Now that we've discussed all of these text-based styles, let's look at examples of each of them. I've loaded the font style sample page, and this includes a number of built-in styles embedded within the page. For the body, I've selected a font style of italic, so everything within the body element should be italic, and the font size should be extra large for everything within the body element. Well, and that includes everything on my page, as you can see. We also have 4 ID-based styles. We've chosen 4 different font styles: italic, normal, oblique, and inherit. And actually, it's easier to see this if I put the italic and the oblique next to each other. So let's move those around. So here, you're going to be asked, can you tell the difference between italic and oblique? Those with a sharp eye might be able to see the difference. In any case, if I sync this up, P1 should be italic, P3 should be oblique. And the only difference is the italic one uses the italic version of the font, which is the default font for this page, and the oblique one programmatically tilts the characters over. I personally have a hard time seeing it. Maybe you can distinguish the difference between P1 and P3. P2 is normal, that uses the normal font style, and P4 inherits. That means it inherits the style from the parent. To prove that, let me come up here and change the default font style for body to be normal. Now, if I refresh the page, because this inherits from the parent, it gets the normal font style. Now, if you don't specify a font style, that's the behavior you get. You would only use this if you wanted to override some other font that was specified, maybe in some other style sheet, or you could use this as an inline style if P4 normally was, say, italic, but you wanted this specific instance of it to inherit from the parent, whatever the parent was. Let's move on and look at font variant. Let me close this down. Don't save the changes. Font variant. In source view, I have here the body style defined. So for the normal body, we'll have Verdana font, extra large, and we're using a font variant of small caps. So unless something overrides that behavior, it's going to appear in small caps. Here we'll use normal for H1, small caps for H2, and inherit, those are the only three options, for H3. And by the way, you can see these because you get IntelliSense as you type. There are the three possible options. I'll choose inherit here, putting it back the way it was. Now if we look at this in design view, we should see the first one, H1, is set to normal. H2 is set to small caps, and you can see that these are all capitalized even though the text is not. And H3 is set to inherit, so it gets whatever the parent element has. And again, the only reason you'd use this would be to override some behavior that's coming in from some other style sheet. Okay, that's font variant. There weren't many options there. Font weight gets kind of tricky. Let's look at the source for this one. And you'll see I've defined for the body a default formatting, which is a font size of extra, extra large, a font family of Arial, and a font weight of bold. So unless told otherwise, the font weight will be bold for everything in the body. Then I've defined one ID-based style for every possible option. Normal, bold, those are the two you're most likely to use. Lighter and bolder, those are with respect to the normal font weight. That's bold in this case. And then we have a font weight of 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and so on for each of the paragraphs here. So let's go look at it in design view. This is normal, so that's what the normal weight would be. This is bold, looks a little bolder. This is lighter. Remember, that's in comparison to what it would have been, and it would have been bold. So when I set it to lighter, it comes out not as bold, or in this case, just light. Here we have bolder, which should be bolder than the original font, which was bold. This should be extra bold, but this font doesn't apparently have that. And we can look at the fonts down here, 100, 200, 300, 400. They're not terribly light, but we're getting bolder as we go. You can discern a difference, I bet, between 500, 600, and 700 here. 800 and 900, nah, not seeing it. So once we get up to this bold weight, they're pretty much all the same, at least in this font. It's interesting, though, in this font, 500, 600, and 700 do appear slightly different. You'll need to decide for the font you're using which weight you'd like to use. Font size, again, has a lot of options. If we look at the markup for this page, you'll see that we have a number of ID-based styles. By default, the body is set to be extra large. It's all relative, but we've chosen extra large. And now we'll use each of the relative sizes. Here we have the comparative sizes, that is compared to the size it would have been if I hadn't specified anything. And down here, we have relative sizes based on percentages. And finally, specific absolute sizes. And we have paragraphs down here that describe each of those things with IDs that link the styles with the paragraphs. Let's go to design view and see. This is XX small, X small. They're pretty much the same for this font. Small, medium, large, extra large, and XX large. So you can see the range there. This is smaller than it would have been if I hadn't specified anything. This is the inherited size, so it definitely is smaller. And this is the larger size than this. Now we have 50% of the default size and 30% of the default size, and finally 120% of the default size. Down here, we have specific sizes, as in 18 point, half an inch, 3 centimeters, and 30 pixels. You have a lot of choices on font size. You'll need to pick the one that makes the most sense for your particular application. Let's finish up by looking at text decoration, which is this page. I'll shut this one down first. Text decoration, view markup. And here you see this one defines the default for the body of having a text decoration of underline. So unless told otherwise, everything will be underlined. Here you'll see that P1 through P4 try out inherit, overline, line through, and P4, hey, try everything. Underline, overline, and line through, something you're unlikely to actually use in public. Finally, I have an anchor element that has its text decoration set to none, just to show you how you can perform the evil operation of removing underlines from links in your pages, should you want to do that. But let me recommend that you don't. People hate that. All right, let's try it. If we try this out, you'll see that we have our 4 paragraphs describing what we want, plus our link, an A link. Notice nothing in here says remove the underline, but let's show the page. We get the inherited, which should be underlined, but it's not. Isn't that interesting? Here we have overline, which is correct. Line through is correct. This has all 3. This is a link with no underline. Why does this not show what it should? It's because Visual Studio has a small, what's the word? Problem. If I show this in the browser, it shows up correctly. So I can just attribute that to Visual Studio not rendering that page correctly. What I don't understand is, since Visual Studio is hosting Internet Explorer, how come it looks correct in the browser but not within Visual Studio? Can't tell you. But in any case, if you see something that doesn't look correct in Visual Studio, show it in the browser. That'll be your final arbiter of whether it works correctly or not. There are several different color attributes that you can use, including color and background color. You can specify the border color or each individual edge of the border. Border bottom, border left, border right, border top color. You can specify the outline color. You can use color keywords like aqua, gray, navy. There's a bunch of built-in colors. You can use system colors like active border, active caption, and so on. You can specify an RGB value using the RGB function, where you specify a red, a green, and a blue value. We'll see how to do that. And you can specify a hex value, like #FF00FF, providing the red, the green, and the blue portions as hexadecimal values. For margins and alignment, you can set margins for an element or for the entire page. You can set the margin, the top, the right, the bottom, the left. You can set each individual edge, margin left, margin right. The first example lets you specify in one attribute, margin, and then the top attribute, the right, the bottom, and the left. Or you can individually set the attributes using margin left, margin right, and so on. There's the text indent attribute that lets you indent text. For all margin and indent values, you can specify either points, inches, centimeters, or pixels. And there's also the text align attribute, which can be left, center, or right. So you get a lot of flexibility on margins and alignment, many different values you can specify. Now, when it comes to positioning, CSS provides attributes to fine-tune the positioning of your content. And this is one of the main uses of CSS, and that is to position things specifically on the page. And you can use relative or absolute positioning. If you choose relative positioning, Well, that's the default for most browsers. You specify relative positioning to change locations from their default. That is, you tell it how far to move it from where it would have been if you hadn't specified anything. That is, it's in relation to where the browser would have placed the element otherwise. There are attributes like position, whether it's relative or absolute, top, which is a distance from the top border, and left, a distance from the left border, and since it's relative, those values mean distance from the top border of where it would have been otherwise. For absolute positioning, this allows you to place things at specific locations. You define the position by the X and Y coordinates, and you measure from the top and left of the browser window. Let's try some examples showing off all of these various style attributes. I've opened the sample page color.htm, and you can see that we have some default behavior for the body, nothing that affects colors in this case. I have a table description here, so any table element will use these styles. The border style is groove. Well, we haven't talked about border style. The options are dash, dotted, double, groove, and so on. Border width, haven't talked about that one, but you can see the options are medium, thick, thin, and inherit. Here's border color, where I define the 4 edges of the border, and then I override one of those by specifying the top color as being fuchsia. And I've used color names here, and you can see the color names are somewhat limited. There aren't that many color names, about 16, I think. And then we move on to window names. And I do want to point one thing out. 3D lie shadow. It's spelled wrong in the IntelliSense. It's been spelled wrong in Visual Studio since the first version. It's still spelled wrong. But if you attempt to use the value in the IntelliSense, the code won't work. So you'd think by this version they would have noticed that it's spelled wrong and fixed it. But no, it's still spelled wrong. So if you want to use, for whatever reason, 3D light shadow, you can accept the value from IntelliSense. You just need to fix it yourself so that it becomes a recognized color name. It's funny because Visual Studio still complains about it. Isn't that funny? But the browser won't accept it unless you spell it right. Very interesting error there. Okay, let me put it back to fuchsia. There we go. And now we have other ways of specifying colors. We can use a hexadecimal value here, or use the RGB function to specify the red, the green, and the blue values. And by the way, if they're all the same, it's some color of gray. That's the way colors work. We're also using here some of the Windows colors, scroll bar, highlight, window text, and so on for item 2 and item 3. You can see within our table, we have some ID-based styles, item 1, item 2, item 3, and so on. So we're assigning these styles to those ID-based elements. To the table, we'll use this style. Let's look at it. Well, you can see that we have the border set to groove, and the border color is red, green, blue, and yellow, except the border top color is fuchsia. So the red got replaced with fuchsia, and we have green on the right, blue on the bottom, yellow on the left. For item 1, we have a color, which is this grayish something, and a background color, which is a darker gray. For item 2, highlight text is the color, that must be white, and background color is the highlight text, which must be blue. For item 3, we have window text as the color, and background color is scroll bar. So you can see there are a number of different ways to apply color to these elements within this table. I'll bring up the margins page to think about working with margins. Now there's not too much going on in here in terms of margins. You can see that the margin top for body is set to 1 inch. So the body should be 1 inch from the top of the page. We also have alignment set for H1 to be center, the indent for UL elements to be 50 pixels, and the indent on a style for a class named indent to be 75 pixels. Well, let's see where that comes into play. We do have H1 here, so H1 should be centered. We have P, so it should be a medium font size. We have a UL element, so it should be indented 50 pixels. And then we have LI, which have nothing really applied to them, so they should inherit from their parent. Down here we have one LI who has a class of indent, so it should be indented 75 pixels, and the same thing for this one. If we review it now, we should see that some of the elements are indented. We have a 1-inch margin at the top, and the entire list is indented by 50 pixels. To review, the list is indented 50 pixels. You can see that there. The ones that have a class of indent are indented 75 pixels, Ajax and JavaScript. So you can use this formatting and layout information to identify exactly where you want to put things on the page, using the margin and the text align attributes. Now, in terms of relative positioning, let's open this page. It's very similar. We have the same things here for the most part. We're also using some relative positioning. So for P elements, for example, I'm using relative positioning. It should be 1 inch down and 80 points to the right of where it normally would have been. We're setting the left to be 80 points farther over than it would have been normally. For the UL, that's our list, we're going to have relative positioning. Top is -50, so it moves up by 50 pixels, and the left moves to the right by 50 pixels. So we're moving things around by modifying styles. Let's go to split view, and you'll see that things are a little moved around. Here's the P element, and it's moved, well, let's see. The P element has been moved 1 inch down from where it should be and 80 points to the right from where it should be. Well, we can easily move things around without touching the content just by changing these styles. Let's make this 20 point, for example. And now it's only 20 points to the right of where it would have been. Let's make this be 1 centimeter. And now it'll be 1 centimeter below where it would have been otherwise. So you can play around with modifying the layout of your page just by modifying styles that use relative or absolute positioning. But that's the point. You don't need to modify the content, you just modify the styles instead. Let's close this down, not saving changes, and look at absolute.htm. This one uses some absolute positioning. It says for H1, position it absolutely at 50 from the top and 50 from the left, and choose a color and display HTML and CSS. Now I've made these styles inline, so I can have multiple different versions of the same style. So here I have an H1, which is interesting. It is 48 pixels from the top and 48 pixels from the left with a different color, which allows me to do something like this. It gives me a sort of shadowing behind the text. Just by positioning things absolutely a couple pixels off in a different color, you can create for yourself a shadow effect. I do have to display the same text twice to get that effect, but you can see that it does work nicely using absolute positioning. You can't discuss styles without also discussing the div and span tags. Imagine this HTML. How would you format only the word powerful? You have powerful in the middle of an H1 element. I want it to have a different style. How can I do it? Well, there needs to be some way to apply a style to a subset of a larger element. The answer is to use the div and span elements because they provide a way to format portions of larger content. Both provide containers for other content, and if they're containers, they can have styles applied to them. The difference is the div element includes a line break both before and after it, and the span element includes no line breaks. So in the previous example, where I wanted to format the word powerful, it's the span element that would be useful. So you can see I've placed a span element around it with a style attribute indicating I want its color to be teal. Because it's a span element, I don't get a line break before and after the text. Well, let's try a demonstration that shows off this technology. I've loaded up my div span demonstration here, and you can see just a body element, and within there an H1 element. Within H1, I have "This is a powerful internet technology!" exclamation point. But I want powerful to be in teal, and I want technology to be with a background of black and a color of white on its own line. So I've done that by using a span element which contains the word powerful, and I've applied a style to that little bit of text. The same goes for technology. I have a div element, and the div element, you'll remember, causes line breaks before and after the text. We've applied a style to that text, and there's the text itself. If I go to Design View, you'll see there's the word powerful in teal in the middle of that H1 element. Here's technology, which is on its own line, black background, white text, and an exclamation point. Now there is a slight weirdness going on here. If you go to Source View, everything in here is inside an H1 element. Yet when Visual Studio displays it, technology and exclamation point don't appear to be in the H1 style. Let's view this in a browser. And it looks correct. So there's another place where Visual Studio's rendering of the page doesn't really match what it's going to look like in a browser, and there's a reason for that. If you look at the source again, there's a little squiggledy thing there, which says element div cannot be nested within element H1. Now the problem is I've got my validation set to use XHTML 1.0 transitional. This is a setting you can modify. Since this isn't valid within the validation I'm using, they just disregard it and don't keep it within the H1 style. There are lots of ways I could work around this. I could end the H1 here and start it back up down here and so on. I could work this out. But this is valid in Internet Explorer. It's just not valid within the validation rules that I've selected for my HTML here. And you can even see it up here. That's the validation I've specified for this page by default. You can assign styles, as you've seen, based on the element type, the class name, or an element ID. The element ID allows only one instance per every page because every element ID must be unique on the page it's on. The class name allows many elements to share the formatting, and you can assign more than one class name to an element. That's not a problem. You just use a space as a delimiter within the attribute. So if you want more than one class name, you would just say class equals class name, space, class name, space, class name, and so on. You create a class name like element.classname. This is pretty cool. To limit the formatting to members of a class that also have to be a member of a particular element type. So for example, if I wanted a special class name, maybe Make Me Bold is my class name, but I only wanted this style to apply to elements that had the class name Make Me Bold who were also, say, H1 elements, I could name the class H1.MakeMeBold, and then that style would only apply to H1 elements who also had a class name of Make Me Bold. Again, this is a way to handle inheritance or cascading of style sheets to limit within a certain page certain styles to certain kinds of elements. You can also consolidate attribute settings. For example, here we have H1, H2, and H3. They're all the same. They have the same style. You can consolidate those to this H1, H2, H3, and then describe the style for each of them in one place. Now you can also do this even more. You can consolidate this sort of thing where we have H1 and H2, and we have these font family, font size, font weight, font style, and then margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. And you'll see that each of those can be consolidated. The font style allows you to specify the weight, the style, the size, and the family in that order, separated with spaces. The margin attribute allows you to specify top, right, bottom, and left in that order, sort of going around the edge of the thing. There are other styles that also allow you to consolidate in this way. So if you want to set all of the settings associated with the font or margin or color, it happens with colors around the edge, border color, I think, you can do the same sort of consolidation. Look those up. They're an easier way to set multiple styles for a single selector. Well, let's run one last demo to investigate a few more styles on our sample application. I've loaded the Classes and IDs sample page, and you see here a number of element-based styles. Body is going to be Verdana font. H1 will be 24-point centered. P elements will be 12-point, and LI elements will be 9-point. And so we have some of those here on the page. We also have a class-based style, Italic Me, which becomes italicized. That's here. And notice that that class adds on to, doesn't replace, but adds on to the style defined here in the H1 element style. And we also have a Bold Me class. That Bold Me class really only applies to LI elements, but it's a real class. I can choose it on any element I like. Here's an LI element. We know it works there. Let's try it here. Can I assign Bold Me here? Certainly can. You won't do anything because this isn't an LI element, but it still is acceptable and I can assign it there. We see here an HTML item ID-based style, so it should apply to this element. Well, let's make sure it all works. Go to Design View, and it seems to be working. I need to go to Split View to see what we have. H1 was 24-point centered, it is, and it's also italicized because of the Italic Me class-based style applied to it. The P class says it's bold, but clearly it's not because it's not an LI element. Down here, we have an LI whose ID is HTML item, and that was supposed to be red. It is. We have an LI whose class is Bold Me, and since it's an LI element, it does get bolded. Down here, we have the same thing again, just to prove that we can have multiple members of the Bold Me class, because that's the way classes work. We can only have one instance of the HTML item style because it is an ID-based style, and only one item on the page can have that ID.